capitalism and corporatization of higher education. She is a member of Algorithmic Governance Research Network, ELTI and ELTIF. She is internal quality assurance cells coordinator of his college, leading the accreditation team and ranking teams with the received A grade by NAC. She has a coordinator and organized secretary of international and national conferences in the college also. And it is my pleasure to announce that she is going to address us with the topic pandemic and politics of disposability, literary academic responses to migrant labors. That is the migrant labor's exodus. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. So thank you once again for joining us. And now on the virtual platform, I handle the stage to Ma'am Minnie M. Ibrahim. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, sir. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Right. Thank you. So first of all, may I place on record my gratitude to Swami Swatantranand Memorial College, Gurdaspur in Punjab. And thank you, Jai Singh sir, for giving me this opportunity to interact with people in Punjab. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at an international conference. So thank you, the organizers of Swami Swatantranand Memorial College, and thank you, Jai Singh ji. May I share screen, sir? I mean, am I given permission to share screen?
Definitely, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you can share screen because you are the host.
Okay, thank you. So the title of my presentation is Pandemic and the Politics of Disposability, Literary Academic Responses to the Migrant Labor Exodus. So I should be talking about an event which took place about a year ago when the lockdown started last year in 2020. And all of us had witnessed a large group of migrant laborers who were forced, I mean, because of the lockdown, they lost their jobs, they lost their means of livelihood, and they had access to food and the basic amenities of life. And this had forced them to flee to their respective villages, and they were forced to do so on foot. So this particular event had shaken up the conscience of the academia and the public alike. And we had certain responses. And I shall be dealing with three of the responses which came in the wake of the long walk by the migrant laborers last year. So one is an academic essay which was written by Professor Pramod K. Nair. One is a newspaper article, a journalistic piece, which was written by Arundhati Roy. And one was a poem which came out in The Quint. So I shall be discussing these three as responses to the pandemic in the early stages. So I just hope my screen can be shared. Just a second. Just bear with me for a moment. Just a second. I'm sorry about this. Just a moment. I'm sorry. I'll start my presentation. Let me see how I can share screen. Okay. The COVID-19 pandemic. Excuse me for a moment. The pandemic and its accompanying tumult has spawned philosophical, practical, innovative, and future reflections by all intellects. The events around us and the responses by nation states, whether it is in the politics of the vaccine, whether it is in protecting the population or sections of population, it makes out what Zizek terms as terrorism and civilization. In such trying times, it compels one to speak about the role of literature and humanities in the largest scheme. What should be their approach, and how can literature and humanity at sustaining the values of human life while dealing with an exigency? Can literature and humanities play a crucial role in promoting an ethical representation of events? This is the informing question that the present presentation attempts to answer modestly. The importance of humanities and literature can be measured by what Hillis Miller calls the accuracy with which the literary works reflect the real world or functions as a guide to conduct for readers living in that world. Its role is also to promote among students and public critical thinking that might help them to resist being taken in by the lies which they are bombarded from all sides they inspire. This discernment can be developed through critical inquiry into the representation of events. Humanitarian agencies and reduce the gaps between research, practice, by putting up organized studies and assessments to be converted into helpful actions. Representation, central to literature and humanities, thus becomes a primary tool in playing out the politics of what gets projected and what gets obfuscated. Am I still audible?
Ma'am, you are audible.
Okay. The ethical representation can be done through literature.
Ma'am, there is some
The
disturbance.
ethical representation can be done through literature's many acts of what Martin calls communication.
Ma'am, now there is you are not audible.
Can't unmute. I joined from another laptop because I could screen.
Ah, yes, yes.
Can you help me unmute?
Amit ji, Amit ji, Amit ji, Amit ji, make Ma'am Abraham, Mini Abraham co-host. She has joined from another laptop.
मैम आपको को होस्ट बना दिया है।
Ma'am, you are the co-host now. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay. The ethical representation can be done through literature's many acts of what Martha Nussbaum calls moral communication. She contends that moral communication partakes of both the specificity and emotional and imaginative richness of an individual's efforts and behavior. Okay, I'm once again trying to share screen. I don't know what is happening. Okay. Okay, I hope now it will be okay. Thank God, I hope now my screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am, now it is visible.
Thank you. Okay. She also elaborates upon terms like perception, which implies a fine development of our human capabilities and to see and feel and judge, an ability to miss less and be responsible for more. Pramod Nair sees moral perception as simply the right way of seeing the other, where right refers to an ethical relationship, the reader's ethical relationship with the characters. While discussing the ethical representation of events, Thomas proposes the notion of moral imagination, defined as the imagination that allows us to have the suffering of distant humans as the same sort of claim on us as the suffering of proximate ones. It is the capacity to feel the exigency of wrong suffered by strangers at a distance. The representation, like the moral imagination, would be in the main literary, but cultural texts such as photography, films, and even memes can play a crucial role. So these are the three terms I address. One is moral communication, second is moral perception, and the third is moral imagination. In times of national lockdown, it is only possible to feel the experience of strangers from a distance. While musing on the function of humanities as a response to and reflection of events, this essay argues that cultural texts, cutting across genres and media, and focused on the COVID-19 related situation of migrant labor, becomes tools for moral communication, ethical representation or critique of events, it acts as agents for empathetic with the other. To this end, the essay studies texts all dealing with migrant laborers who were forced to walk 100 kilometers towards their villages due to the unexpected lockdown clamped by the government in the wake of coronavirus outbreak in March 2020, that is last year. The texts include an academic essay, called The Long Walk, Migrant Workers and the Extreme Mobility in the Aeronautics. Newspaper article called The Pandemic is Portal. This was written by Arundhati Roy, and it explores the causes and multiple effects of corona law in various sections of society. And third, this poem called What I Didn't See, and this was published in the Quint. Cultural text as moral communication. As part of its moral communication process, an allegation which rises especially against academic writing is that it seems to exoticize the other by approaching and engaging with it from a safe distance. Theorists like Eaton and Nelwolf argue that exotic is best consumed from within safety and detached from its original contexts that may be wild and agreement remarks. The exotic is a diegetic space and it enables us to encounter but without the of living in it. As such, is the same. So in a way, it is kind of, or in a way, it is a kind of voyeurism where you not a kind of physical engagement with the suffering of the people. This is the accusation of the justifies the argument against exoticization by contending that Sahitya operates beyond the perception. Its creation and consumption, Saul's direct perception is actually accepted. That means you can't go up there. So even if you deal with it from a distance or within your drawing room, it does have meaning. You can't really dismiss as exoticization. Meyer, while describing the travails of the laborers with a pungent touch, he faces imagine in extreme mobility under an immobility regime. Ironically, the agentic coordinates for extreme mobility consist of when he had migrant workers across the Indian state. There is not academic objectification or exoticization, but feeling the suffering of distant humans on par with the suffering of proximate ones. Roy, now this was about the academic essay. Now I shall talk about Arundhati Roy's article. Now what does she say? She makes a statement which is analogous to Pramod Nair's. She says, as they walked, some were beaten brutally and humiliated by the police, who were charged with strictly enforcing the curfew, who were made to jump down the highway. Outside the town of Bareilly, one group was herded together and hosed down with a chemical spray because people suspected that they were terrorists. So they hosed down with a chemical spray. All these are expressions of strong indignation and not exoticization. Now, in a different key, the poem published in the Quint, that expresses strong emotion evoked by a visual. Visual is the visual of the migrant laborers who were running away. So this visual inspired a poem. So what was this poem? What did I see? Of migrant laborers fleeing cities? Blue skies, wide shining roads, green trees. These videos, helpless and ugly poor, tired of the city, hungry towards their villages. The homeless are probably without data, hence visible. Here in these videos, they will be walking 100 kilometers, a mother and a differently able daughter. What I could see is that they without transport, since there is no, they are unemployed. What the reasons for the charge of the paradox of aesthetics and dissemination of the outsider's predicament. Linsky said that the aesthetic of beauty, of human beings, of nature, of objects, it generates the desire for application and production of more beauty than that literature which points to the beauty of human ethical hunger to demand a return to the beauty in various parts of the world. So, the all of human rights. On that, if you show them, you are blamed of exoticization and on the other hand, unless you talk about it, how will the public and how will the authorities know about the suffering of a group of people? Ethical demand for more just social arrangements. The paradigm of heroicness that frames the condition of the migrant workers expects that in prevail in the most horrific of conditions, no wages, no food, no jobs, and a virus on the move. Arundhati Roy too highlights the injustice when she says, every one of the walking people I spoke to was worried about the virus, but it was less real, less present in their lives than the looming unemployment and the violence by police. So Arundhati actually met these laborers who were fleeing, and she said they were more worried about their loss of living rather than the about patient than the virus. These three texts and the poem, it tries to prod consciously. The poems are probably baseless without data, hence invisible to me. So this is a reference to the fact that the migrant laborers probably did not have proper documents, and because they didn't have proper documents, they are invisible. These texts, by a paradox of aesthetics, where the restoration of that dignity. In any way, ethical, political value, they are not objective or distant or exercise in literary, political, or academic exoticization. They are exercises in moral communication aimed at prodding the reader's conscience about the other by an ethical, aesthetic representation of events. Now, I move on to cultural texts, the notion of hunger within literature, and coming to the second point, what is hunger in and of literature? Ranjan Ghosh points to the ethics of Sahitya as inscribed in a variety of hunger to explicate the various ways of human experience and engagement with emotions. He adds, for me, this aesthetic hunger in Sahitya is about forming, foregrounding, and fictionalizing the other. Ghosh also vouches for the ineliminable hunger in Sahitya to evolve greater modes of meaning and deeper enclaves of sense. He adds, the and assimilation is recycling, reimagining, and story energy. To explicate a Darwin experience is refracted through the intellectual prism when Nair sees the event of hyper-incarnation stuck Okay. I hope my screen is still visible.
Ma'am, screen is not visible.
Screen is not visible. Okay,
No.
I'll do that. Is it okay? Is it visible now, Jester?
Yeah, it's it's about to come. Not yet visible.
Visible?
Yeah, now it is visible.
Now visible. Okay, fine. I'm going to explicate a dire human experience is reflected. Again.
Ma'am, again screen sharing is disconnected.
I don't know why this is happening. Okay. He says that the ones who are stuck have to wait for the crisis to blow over. This recycling and reimagining of an event can be seen as Tory energy. It also resonates with Judith Butler's comments on the spurious distinction between and ungrievable lives. That is, those who should be protected against death at all costs, and those whose lives are considered not worth safeguarding against illness and death. This diminished value of human life is echoed in the concluding lines of the poem. Since now there's no rally, they are not important. So, what the author is trying to say, what the poet is trying to say is that as long as there rally, the laborers or these marginalized people, they have meaning. But under the circumstances when there is no political rally, something. Okay. These lives are good valleys or as boat packs. This kind of inequality is not exclusive to India. It is also seen in developed nations in what Sean Owusu calls the politics of disposability. Systemic social inequalities make some more vulnerable members. Racial minorities, elderly, was I muted for a while? I was talking. Continue. So, John, so this kind of inequality is not exclusive to India, and even in the okay, I think I will not share screen because anyway it is getting lost.
Again,
It is a politics.
screen sharing is disconnected now.
Screen sharing is not, so I think I'll
You
leave
can
it.
present the paper directly without
Yeah.
screen sharing.
Right. It's a politics in which the unproductive, that is the poor, the weak, and the racially marginalized, they are considered as useless and therefore expendable. This disposability is thus expressed by Nair. For migrant workers, stay in New Delhi was not option. Since their wages had dropped, there was no work to be found. The lockdown proscribed all movement. Describe the expendable flight of the migrant laborer or the other under lockdown in this manner. Many driven out by their employers and landlords, millions of impoverished, hungry, thirsty people, young and old, men, children, sick people, blind people, disabled people, with nowhere else to go. I don't know to what extent I'm audible because I think it is getting disconnected.
You are audible,
Thus,
ma'am.
okay. By bringing the plight and the politics of interference, evolving deeper enclaves of sense and meaning, argue that these texts, all these three texts, the academic essay, the journalistic, and the poem, all these three texts fulfill the hunger of literature as a response towards the other. Now, the next point I want to talk about is empathetic engagement with the other. The third point about literature's empathetic engagement with the other. The literary text engages with otherness in an attempt to sketch the other's life world through the seeds of the ethical, the political, and the emotional. Jeffrey Galt Harpin states that the humanities and literature in particular are a genre that seems especially committed to an exploration of outsiderhood. So literature especially practices the commitment and exploration of outsiderhood. He reckons that the urge of thought to fulfill this obligation to the other, the outsider, it manifests itself in other than thought. The three texts express their commitment to good. Policymakers, while clamping daily wage workers and us or the outsiders. Never ponders on this situation thus. When implementation laws are put in place, a significant section of this population, the floating migrant workers, for example, for whom a whole new regime is instituted. Roy travails of the migrant laborer stating, our mega cities to exclude their working class citizens like so much wanted accurate. The poem points to the invalid migrant laborer or the other, even in the video featuring their exodus. What did I see in the videos of migrants? Blue tall buildings, green trees. It's all so beautiful in India. So what she means is that, what the poet means is that being migrant laborers, but what do you and I notice? We do not, we do notice the migrant laborers fleeing, but more than that, what catches our eye is skies, the tall buildings and the wide shining roads. And the migrant laborer about whom the video was made, they become, in a way, invisible. We see a moral question at work. The poem talks about the invisibility and inaudibility of the insignificant fleeing masses, the compass pointing at the reader who shuts himself off from the predicament of the other. You and I watch some visuals on TV, but it doesn't enter our conscience. We possibly just say, okay, poor people, and then we forget about it. That is what the poem is trying to prod the conscience of the reader. What did I not hear in these? They will be walking hundreds, mother and a differently abled daughter, countless people. What I could not see is that they were without transport. Roy's article quotes a fleeing man thus. Maybe when Modiji decided to do this, nobody told him about us. Maybe he doesn't know about us. Okay, we can say that everywhere, certain sections of populations, they will be stuck. They will be especially, it is not a voluntary targeting of certain groups. It's just that some groups, they suffer more than the others. Maybe the salaried people, they are not really bearing the brunt of the lockdown or even the slowdown in businesses. But there are so many people whose livelihoods are directly every lockdown or every time some kind of a restriction is by the government. The government, then there are people and we need to reach out to them in some way or other. So this is what Roy said. He speaks about the state of precarity because lives are lived. It consists of invisible practices of isolation and exclusion, since it is a nation of people whose lives do not matter. Now, when businesses close down, what can the owners do? They can't really do anything. That for the migrant laborer is a question of existence. Maybe for the owner, it's not so existential. It is closer to than this problem. These transforms idea of communication, leading moral perception, and imagination where the this is my, as I said, this is my basic argument. Through moderation, you give rise to moral perception, and this moral perception results in this moral perception. This is what makes people miss less and be responsible for more. This is done by foregrounding the other. That means the other is usually made invisible, so the other is foregrounded out the politics of interference and assimilation, and also producing a recombinatory energy by reimagining and recycling and variously nudging and prodding the readers into seeing, hearing, and calling out for more just social arrangements, thus embodying the spirit of hunger in literature. So as I said, from moral communication to moral perception. Okay, and I conclude my paper by saying that literature, humanities, they perpetually encounter a dilemma. If representation of violence and injustice is done, one may be accused of exoticization, catering to voyeurism, and academic exploitation. On the other hand, to stay silent about violence is tantamount to being complicit with it. If we remain silent, do we not further marginalize already precarious lives? This is the inherent paradox of all given by ethics. Silence issues is read by ethical as some, but it is also as complicity by others. However, isn't literature the fuel on which activism lights its fires? and policymakers are compelled to act and retract, at least occasionally. Incidentally, in Kerala, even in the middle of the lockdown, we had a very certain number of cases. So, the had come, Kerala government, they had a to go back to their homelands. So, in some cases, when such representation is done in TV, in academia, in newspapers, etc., the authorities, they take some action and arrange some kind of a solution for these people. And policymakers are compelled to act and retract, at least occasionally. Can't literature and humanities research and writing influence practices and policies? Does it not impact and shape the public pulse and its socio-cultural thinking? So, should humanities and literature, driven by an ethical hunger, not engage with the other just to avoid controversy? And I believe my presentation, my essay, has demonstrated literature and humanities is central. Literature and humanities, not just sciences. We need the vaccine, we need the sciences, we need the technology, but we also need literature and humanities in an equal measure. It is central to any discussion of precarious suffering and the other. It cannot, must stay silent for fear of being accused of exoticizing. If all possible trouble must come from literature, research, and writing.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. And I put on record my special thanks once again to Jay sir for giving this opportunity, as well as the of these me in this so much. And I'm sorry about some of the technical glitches. I could get my mind across. I just hope so.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a nice presentation. Now the session is over to Prabodji.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. The plight of the migrant laborers very nicely explained by Ma'am Ibrahim and through the journey of literature. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. And now I request for the Dr. Jasingh ji, our organizing secretary, also to deliver his lecture also on the topic Spanish flu, as he has already told us. Spanish flu peeps through literature, a study of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Thank you, sir.
So, Prabodji, thanks for giving me this chance to deliver a talk on pandemic and literature. I will like to start my talk with a very simple phrase taken from Haryana, Punjab region. We generally say, भूखे को तो रोटियां ही नजर आते हैं. A person who is hungry can see only food everywhere. Same can be applied to a person who is struggling with the questions of life and death. When person gets some disease and the fear of death is looming large on that person, the person cannot behave in a normal manner, cannot behave in a coherent manner. Different kind of thoughts come and go. If the person recovers a little, the positive thoughts come. If again there is a dip in the health, again the negative thoughts starts coming up. In a way, some kind of incoherence is there when somebody suffers. Now, as this paper is about Spanish flu, and I will concentrate only on one poem, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. I don't think anybody from the departments of English, there may be many teachers and many students who have ever discussed the wasteland from pandemic's point of view. We might have read it from morality's point of view. We might have found the traces of First World War. So many other things we might have discovered, but not this one. The reason being, we are part of the new criticism which was floated by the modernists themselves. And what modernists say, read words on the paper, don't go beyond. But of course, we have to go beyond, because any work of literature is not just words on paper. A work of literature has its roots in the psyche of the author, in the psyche of the time, in the psyche of the readers. It has its roots in so many other places. Now, when we talk about the influence of Spanish flu on the wasteland, the Wasteland was written, published in 1922, and the Spanish flu was there from 1918 to 1920. When T.S. Eliot started the composition of this period, of this poem, just like in April 2021, we are struggling with the second wave of pandemic. T.S. Eliot was also struggling with the second wave of pandemic when he started composing this poem. So, Spanish flu was there from 1918 to 1920 and affected almost all spheres of human life. It also influenced the creative writers in general and T.S. Eliot in particular. Both T.S. Eliot and his wife, Vivian, they caught the virus in December 1918. And not only T.S. Eliot and his wife, their servant also caught, and they also nursed him to health. T.S. Eliot got the milder attack as compared to his wife. However, the impact of COVID, as when we look at how people were dying, the percentage of casualties, so it affected the psyche of all people, and so it affected the psyche of T.S. Eliot as well, who suffered from it. In a letter written on 8th December 1918, he writes to his mother. What he says, so weak afterwards. Then in another letter he says, the virus affected about while talking about his wife. The virus affected her nerves so that she can hardly sleep at all. So it means the Spanish flu virus was affecting the nerves as well. And when it affected the nerves of his wife, it might have affected his own nerves as well. And his wife, in one of the letters, describes the impact of of Spanish flu on T.S. Eliot, that it left him very weak and he was worrying himself about his mind not acting as it used to. So this is the observation of his wife regarding his mental state. Their letters written to friends and the relatives foreground the Spanish flu attack and its permanent impression on the mind and body of the poet and his wife. So in short, this bout of Spanish flu both preceded and followed a cloud of physical and mental health issues that culminated in T.S. Eliot's nervous breakdown in 1921. So the impact of Spanish flu on his mind was felt much later in 1921 when he had a nervous breakdown. The pandemic's second wave also corresponded with other deaths in the life of T.S. Eliot. His aunt died in 1918. His father died in 1919. Not everybody died of corona, of Spanish flu, but there were deaths. Several months after his 1918 episode, T.S. Eliot wrote to his brother. What he says, there has been a great deal of pneumonic influenza. As everybody knows, after Spanish flu, the people develop pneumonia. The same is the case with coronavirus as well. Once people are affected with the virus, after some time, they get pneumonia. So what he writes to his brother, there has been a great deal of pneumonia influence about, and if one of us got, it would have to go, he would have to go to hospital. His own health remained precarious, as he told to Henry. I have simply had a sort of collapse. I slept almost continuously for 2 days and now I am up. I feel very weak and easily exhausted. In the months leading up to nervous breakdown, during which he wrote, he worked on the Wasteland. So when he was writing the Wasteland, he was living under the shadow of Spanish flu pandemic, and that was the period when he started having the nervous breakdown. So when we look at the poem being written by a person who is constantly getting nervous breakdown and living under the shadow of death, our idea of the poem may undergo change. If we read The Wasteland without taking into account all these things, we only talk about the First World War. But when we look at the poem and the nervous breakdown and the impact of the Spanish flu virus and what kind of hallucinations one can get when one has high fever, because in those days there was no paracetamol to bring down the fever. There was no glucose, no facilities. And it was very easy to get hallucinations due to fever as well. So in the months leading up to his nervous breakdown, during which he worked on the Wasteland, T.S. Eliot linked Spanish flu, dryness, and the landscape in a ways that resonate in this poem. In his London letter, which he wrote to Dial in 1921, he reports a hot, rainless spring and a new form of influenza which leaves extreme dryness and a bitter taste in the mouth. And you see, this phrase appears in his The Wasteland. Dryness and bitter taste in the mouth. A glimpse into the sufferings that the poet underwent during Spanish flu attack and afterwards in the form of nervous breakdown corresponds with several expressions recorded in The Wasteland. The sense of innervation, fragmentation, and vulnerable bodies are of course ironic elements. So this innervation, fragmentation, and vulnerable bodies, these three things which resonate in the poem directly or indirectly are taken from medical philosophy. Of course, ironic elements of The Wasteland, though they have not been seen through the pandemic lens, as perhaps the quintessential modernist poem of the 20th century, the work with all its corpses, bones, and malaise has been subject to wide-ranging critical attention. We find the terms corpse, bones, and malaise in the poem, and we directly associate it with the First World War. But these terms are also associated, rather more closely associated, with the Spanish flu. Part of the poem's power is that T.S. Eliot did the same thing for post-pandemic consciousnesses, channeling a set of experiences and fragments that were haunting the culture but were difficult to represent. He may or may not have been channeling pandemic experiences intentionally. He may not be using pandemic intentionally as the background of the poem. But as I told you in the beginning, what a hungry man sees. When we are hungry, what we see, what we feel. Our dreams are about food. When we are hungry, we do not dream of a car. We dream of food, tasty foods, different kinds of foods. The same is the case with a person who gets Spanish flu in those days when there were no medical facilities as the kind of medical facilities we have now. What kind of dreams he will have? What kind of language that person will have? So he is not using the pandemic, he may not be using the pandemic intentionally, but unintentionally it is very much there in the poem. But he grants a voice to widespread experiences that by their nature were incoherent and elusive. Eliot strove in his poem not to mention any particular event directly, and he famously exhorted the war poets for including the war in their works. As the critic H.K. Black has detailed, poetry T.S. Eliot wrote, what he says about poetry, a note on war poetry, should be an abstract conception of private experience as it greatly intensified, become universal. As T.S. Eliot observes in Tradition and Individual Talent, Poetry should instead seek to capture and distill a range of experiences that would otherwise be missed. Poetry, he writes, is a new thing resulting from the concentration of a very great number of experiences which to the practical and active person would not seem to be experiences at all. See this definition. What he says, poetry is a new thing from the concentration of very large number of experiences which to the practical and active person would not seem to be experiences at all. A person involved in the manual labor may not feel those things, but a person who is involved in high intellectual activities like T.S. Eliot, when has to suffer from Spanish flu, he may get so many experiences. And those experiences indirectly are present in his poem, The Wasteland. The Wasteland as a powerful, we can look at the Wasteland as a powerful record of the pandemics enduring an emotional and physical cost. We as well as a record of the denial that surrounded it, even as a culture remains mired in guilt, suffering and fear it produces. Indeed, T.S. Eliot's aim to capture ordinary experiences that would otherwise be missed was ideally suited for the elusive body and the mental sensation the virus caused. The Wasteland can be read as a record of the sensory experiences of acute infection, including what are the experiences of Spanish flu. So what are the experiences of Spanish flu? Reality binding delirium, because when the temperature is high, so some kind of delirium should be there and the reality binding happens. So the reality is not as it is. The fever, the dehydration and the threat of drowning. These are the experiences of Spanish flu. It is also a poem that evocatively captures three widespread experiences that came in the pandemic wake. And what are these external experiences? Initially, I told you what are the experiences at the psychological level, but there are, of course, experiences in the outside society. Death. In Europe, the death rate was 8 to 12%. On the other hand, in India, in some parts, it reached up to 26% because in India there were no medical facilities. So death is there, which is reflected in the bones, corpses, rats, and insecure burial. Viral resurrections. Virus is coming back. When he says the dead body is regenerating, you see, the people are dying. They say after the patient dies, the virus does not spread, but it is still spreading. He may not be talking about, he in one place, they planted the dead body. So the people who are dying, that process itself, their cremation process itself may spread Spanish flu virus. So that is a resurrection of virus. including perpetual states of living death, and barren trope. So living death, the kind of life one is living under the shadow of death, that is living death, and barren tropes of sacrificial renewal, and finally the arrival of silence and the breakdown of communication in the face of so much suffering. The very opening of the Wasteland, told from the corpus point of view, granting a beneath the ground perspective from within the dead body. Buried within the poem is a parallel perspective, what reality looks like from within bodies suffering from acute illness. When the person is suffering, when the person is living under the shadow of death, how he will look at the world. T.S. Eliot develops his own hallucinatory delirium mode, one that parallels conditions we have seen in the pandemic. Accounts explored so far on the broadest level, the poem's well-known fragmentation, its multiple voices, and its constant leaps from topic to topic suggest what we might term a delirium logic, a comprehensive vision of reality from within a fever dream. More specifically, various moments seem to slip into particular bodies or perhaps memories. The disintegrating language at the end of, when you look at the end of the fire sermon, what we find? See the lines: burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest burning. So see the repetition of burning. These allusions, though don't explain the confusion of the lines or their incomplete quality when seen through the lens of pandemic. The lines embody the experimental reality of a delirium brought on by high fever. A body experiences that would have been painfully familiar to contemporary reader, as one survivor remembered his broken language that reflected T.S. Eliot's own fears about his flu case. So this burning may refer to high fever. Fever, every bone acts in your body. You surely do not think straight for weeks afterwards. Such agitated bodies are evoked in the repetition of burning. You see, when somebody gets high fever, the one is not able to think straight for weeks afterwards. And this kind of agitated bodies are evoked in the repetition of burning. A delirious tossing back and forth, a gerund form reflecting the ongoing quality of his experiences. After the frenzy of the first line, the speaker seems to run out of breath and energy, not making it to the end of the third line before falling silent and then muttering a final and seemingly weaker burning, which such moments are later fleshed out in the Potter's and the Wolf's depiction of flu delirium and high burning fever. Now, when one is suffering from the virus, Spanish flu virus, it weakens the body significantly. And after writing a few lines, the writer feels completely exhausted. He is not able to sit for longer hours. He sits and he writes, and then next time when he sits, his state of mind is completely changed, because the people who suffered from Spanish flu, their state of mind kept changing continuously because the virus attacked the nerves as well. Even now, people who had undergone acute infection of coronavirus, they know how much psychological suffering they had undergone. This poem's final section, the hallucinatory quality intensifies in the correspondent movement concerning here. I will read one section from the Wasteland. A woman drew her long black hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on their strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistle and beat their wings and crawled head downward down a blackened hole. And upside down in air were towers tolling reminiscent bells that kept the hours, and voices singing out of empty cistern and exhausted wells. It is the decayed hole among the mountains. In the faint moonlight, the grass is singing. You see how he is trying to come to terms and what kind of imagery he is using. In the first two lines, there is women. In the second two lines, he's talking about the bats with baby faces. Now, these bats with baby faces, it hints at the kind of life the patients had to undergo. Here, turning into fiddle strings, which turn into sound, the airy forms from the previous passage have morphed into bats and baby faces crawling down walls. The sufferer's world has turned upside down, and the ambient sounds have grown more ominous and distorted. Whispered music, whistling bats, tolling bells, voices from empty cisterns, and wells and singing grass. See the imagery. When he is positive, he is talking about singing grass and the bells. But when he is sick, he is under the influence of hallucination, maybe having fever. And in Spanish flu, the fever keeps coming and going. Additional hallucinatory moments capture a previous body experience in the pandemic. The burning thirst that accompanies high fever. So he talks about burning thirst so many times. Why it is burning thirst? Burning thirst means the body is burning with fever and the patient feels thirsty. And you know, when there is a high fever, the person wants cold water because it brings down the body temperature. As noted earlier, T.S. Eliot linked thirst to Spanish flu, noting in the dial letter from 1921 that what he writes about the relationship between Spanish flu and thirst. A new form of influenza had appeared which leaves extreme dryness and bitter taste in the mouth. In the poem's final section, the sufferer's desperate thirst mingles with delirium. If you read the last paragraph, the final section, we find if there were water, we should stop and drink. He's talking about water because water is very important, cold water especially when somebody gets high fever. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the row, one cannot stop or drink or stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the row, that mountain mouth of carries feet and cannot speak. So the mouth has gone dry that he is not even able to speak. The language portrays a wandering in the desert as well as among metaphoric spiritual crises. but it also embodies a pandemic perspective, manifesting confusing thinking, bodily distortions. The feet are in the sand, and the body seems already dead. Sweat is dry. Helplessness and overwhelming thirst in the hair passage just discussed, the voice singing from empty cistern and exhausted wells. Suggest a similar hallucinatory dryness a few lines later. The speaker becomes even more drained, the language tearing down as exhaustion take over. I will read a few lines. These lines also throw light on the pandemic body. If there were water and no rocks, if there were rock and also water and water, not the cicadia and not dry grass singing, but sound of the water over a rock. Drip, drop, 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 but there is no water. And there is no water. The language is feverish. The speaker jumps between broken thoughts and circling back to a sense of thirst. The delirium, in fact, underlies the modernist fragmentation. The language links a literary thirst and a language broken by fever and reduced to sound. Eliot's poem serve as a memorial to bodily states, not just spiritual and psychological state. So this poem is not just about the psychology or the spiritualism. This poem is about the body as well. A record of suffering and confusion caused by pandemic translated into language in both its form and content. Amid the hallucinatory thirst, T.S. Eliot depicts an opposite state that paradoxically accompanied the dryness and dehydration of the pandemic. So two features of this pandemic, Spanish flu, are dryness and dehydration. The same is the case with coronavirus as well. What are the influences of corona? This coronavirus thickens blood. Once the blood is thickened, then nothing works. That is why in the treatment of corona, they put blood thinner medicine, which keeps the blood thinner, and there should be no clots. So he also talks about water. And he sees the drowned Phoenician sailor in the tarot card. The body will find again in part death by water. So there is a Phoenician sailor who is drowned. Now, when we look at how this Spanish flu spread from one place to another place, the ships played a very important role in taking the virus from one continent to another continent. So when we talk about the drowned Phoenician sailor in the tarot card, it is a reference to how the corona spread with the help of sailors. A body we find against, in part, death by water. So now we have death by water, which offers us Phribas' corpse, who was once handsome and tall as you. So in death by water, we find reference to and even photograph of Philibius, the sailor seemingly within the most death-targeted group of the pandemic, coheres and simply the many soldiers who were the central cause of the death in the pandemic when fluid flooded the lungs. Now, when we talk about how the pandemic influenced the lungs, the Spanish flu also, the modus operandi of Spanish flu was also by and large same. The virus enters the lungs, breaks the cell walls, and the lungs are filled with water. And once the lungs are filled with water, there is no choice except to go to the doctor, and that water has to be extracted from the lungs. As even at the private level, even if we want, if we were not a soldier, and yet another, the tone of the section is now of overt fear of horror. Shah Kole points out in the scrutiny T.S. Eliot builds a pathogenic atmosphere of wind, fog, and air, the image capturing contagion and the power of the threat alongside its ineffability and diffusiveness. Whatever he intends the images to function in this way is immaterial. He channels the atmosphere at the time. After taking the outbreak's absence, presence in cultural memory, they were hidden in full view. The Wasteland not only captures elements of the pandemic's acute phase as also the individual and collective level. In atmosphere is also its atmosphere is also saturated with two more common outcomes of the outbreak. What are the two outcomes? All and innervated living death. Second, the poem is famously full of dead bodies. So it is full of dead bodies. The opening corpse, Howard Sailor, Philibert, as well as scattered bones, the alley where the dead men lost their lives. The rattle of the The rattle of bones, white bodies naked on low damp ground, and bones cast in a little low dry garret. The water picked. Bones is in having the empty channel holds dry bones, and death extends everywhere from a death land to a death tree and to a death sound. The lurking somewhere hidden qualities of these bodies in the poem also suggest the hunting absence of war corps at the home front, though they were ever present in the memory and in the Miranda. All those had been, all those had, all these bodies had been anything The confluence of rats and dead bodies. Another image we find in the poem is about rats and dead bodies. Provide a telling example of the differences we might see when reading through the lens of the pandemic. In the game of chess, one of the speakers thinks we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. In a parallel passage, in the fire sermon, a rat creeps softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly, while the speaker sees or imagines white bodies naked on the low damp ground and bodies cast in the little low dry garret rattled by the rat's foot only. And the rat is also important here because rats are carrier of many pandemics. Plagues are generally spread by rats. These images, and it's not surprising that even during Spanish flu, people might have found rats responsible for spreading the Spanish flu. Of course, Spanish flu was not spread by the rats, but who can stop the people from believing it? These images again echo the war. Rats were a constant haunting presence in the front, eating the food, eating the dead and evoking horror for the soldiers. The Allies links to the trenches, as does the damp ground and the dead bodies. And yet the pandemic, dead are also buried in these images. Rats are the perennial symbols of disease. For centuries, rats are blamed for the pandemic bubonic plague, to which often to which the Spanish flu is often compared, both in symptoms and in casualties. These rats and bodies seem, after all, to be London's recalling how the pandemic shifting the location of both bodies and danger. Embedded here also are the parallel images of war and plague. The bodies in the low damp ground, the trenches next to the bodies, to the bones in the low dry garret. So endemic of these images, rats, dead bodies and all that, bones, etc., is the airy sense of insecure and disreputed burial. As well known, the pandemic produces its own acute burial problems closer to home. And we know when the coronavirus first wave set in India, the dead bodies of the people who died of corona, they were not handed over to the families. Their cremation was not done in the proper manner. The families could not see their family members for the last time. No, no proper cremation. If they were Hindus, there were no Hindu rituals. If they were Muslim, there were no Muslim rituals. If they were Christian, there were no Christian rituals. So the people who were the victims of coronavirus, they were cremated most disrespectfully. And the same thing happened during the uh, Spanish flu time as well. So this is how this poem, when talks about the problems of dead bodies and their burial, also bring in those problems. Legitimate fears of contagion combined with the numbers of bodies meant mass grave, scarcity of coffins, and disrupted funerals. T.S. Eliot's line about bodies. Now, what is the line? Bodies naked on the low damp ground. See how the bodies are disposed of, not cremated, takes on a new resonance when we look at this image, keeping in mind the pandemic. The poem captures the insecurity at the end of the burial of the dead. The section's title suggests, see, the burial of the dead. The people who are dying of pandemic suggests perverse recasting of traditional Anglican funeral service, a move that in itself reflected the disruption of mourning practices. In the speaker's well-known confrontation with Stetson, Eliot understands the widespread anxiety about burial. I will read a few lines from the poem. There I saw one I knew and stopped him, crying, Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Meli, that copse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? See this. The copse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? The first wave, the second wave, the third wave. After first wave, we think there will be no second wave. In the month of February, we believed seriously that corona is over because all the people who had corona are dead and it's not spreading anymore. But all of a sudden, we get the second wave of corona. So the corpse you planted, not buried, see planted, because the virus is still there and it is emerging again. Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Or keep the dog far hence, that is friend to man, and with his nail he will dig it up again. In a tone of unhinged pleasantry, sharply at odds with the subject, the speaker suggests a periodic resurrection of the virus. The corpse planted last year remains buried but capable of return, threatening the sprout and bloom, threatening to rise from the bed if disturbed, and there may be a second wave of corona. Not corona, Spanish flu at that time, and in our time it's corona. Such an image of a body insecurely buried speaks on both a literal and figurative level of the post-pandemic moment, with coffins scarce and grave diggers overwhelmed. Bodies were in fact buried in backyards. Through the second wave's arrival in the winter months meant that the ground was often too frozen to dig graves and bodies piled up for burial. Sudden frost could in fact disturb the bed. So in conclusion, we can say the poem is full of direct and indirect references to the living death, lending the poem what the Times Literary Supplement identified in 1922 as its purgatorial quality. So many voices in the poem seem stranded, not able to reach the two poles, death or life, definitely. Instead, shuttling between them without ever reaching either extreme. This state affects not only the problem former soldiers in the poem, but seemingly everyone everywhere, as if indeed there is an invisible, deadly force that has sapped bodies of life within cities and domestic spaces. So, after doing the analysis of the wasteland as a product of the poet T.S. Eliot's experiences during the Spanish flu, we find a lot of pandemic is there in this poem and it is not explored. And we know if a writer suffers, if a writer feels something, whether knowingly or unknowingly, it enters his work. I give you another example, not about pandemic and all that. You might have read you might have read uh, Paradise Lost. In the beginning, He criticizes womanhood. He goes to the extent why nature should not find some other means of procreation, because his relationship with his first wife was very bad. But in the 12th book, by that time he had married 3-4 times, and his relationship with his last wife was quite good. So he calls Adam and Eve as comrades. So the personal life of the writer, personal experiences of the writer always get into the work, consciously or unconsciously. So with these words, thank you. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Jasingji. Really, you have compared the Spanish flu with the present corona pandemic in a very nice way. And the peeps through the literature, a study of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is a poem, and of course, you have added to our knowledge that it is really related with the pandemic also of Spanish flu, because otherwise people have not the idea of that thing, who are not of the background of literature, of English literature. Only the sake of knowledge, they read the poem of T.S. Eliot, and they have their own meaning and perceptions in their mind regarding this wasteland. But not only the war, but the epidemic was also behind to disturb the author, or the, I can say. Thank you, sir. Thank you for very soft speech from your side, the soothing effect on us. And I also request Madam Shubkiran to add something. If Madam,
If there are any questions, I am ready to take.
okay. Anybody have any query? Ma'am, Dr. Shubkiran? Okay, sir. Hello. Are you listening to me, sir?
Yes, sir, I am listening to you. And if there are any questions, they can ask me.
Everybody has appreciated in the chat box that it is really a valuable session for us. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So now this is the time to end of the session,
Okay, sir.
end of the morning session.
Yes,
So
sir.
we'll meet again in evening session at 2 p.m.
Thank
Yes.
you, Amiji. Thank you, Amiji. Thank you, Jasmine, sir.
very much, Professor.
We'll meet
Thanks,
at
sir. Thank you
Thank
very much.
you. Thank you for this second day. Thank you, sir.
So thank you, sir. Thanks to all the participants.
Thank you, sir.
I already sent the feedback form in the chat box of YouTube or Zoom platform. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Once again, I thanks all the viewers who are attached with us. Thank you, sir. Thank you. We'll meet at 2 p.m. Special thanks to Dr. Dasingh.